It is another episode of the Juice on the Cuse podcast. Wes Cheng alongside Jim Stechschulte. Thanks so much for joining us on this Tuesday, August 27, 2024. And Jim, we made it. Probably the most anticipated Syracuse season in the last 6 years is here. We're just days away from the kickoff of the Fran Brown era. And Jim, plenty of fodder to talk about. We begin today with former Syracuse offensive lineman and radio color analyst Adam Terry. He was on the Cuse Sports talk show the other day talking about success under Fran Brown, and he said it's a, quote, 500 season, end quote. Jim, we're still rolling out your preview on the Juice Online here on the Rivals Network this week, but spoiler alert, you have Syracuse pegged for more than 6 wins. What did you think when you heard Adam Terry talk about this?
Fact, I do have them pegged at more than 6 wins, but I think Terry gets to something that's probably a little closer to him than what most of us do. Because I think a lot of part of the player acquisition, including the portal and the guys we talk about a lot, are the guys who, if sports cards were still a much more common thing, they'd be the ones putting the stats on the back, whether it's Kyle McCord at quarterback or Oronde Gadsden's return or Fadil Diggs coming to town or Deuce Chestnut's return. All the guys we talk about are the guys who get their names talked about on TV. Adam Terry, despite being a 3-year starter at Syracuse a couple decades ago, not one of those guys because he was an offensive lineman. And so I think he is well within his right to have concerns about the lines, plural, on this roster, not just the offensive one. And, I feel that though, and this might be more something that's more NFL than college football, but especially as the season gets later in the NFL and they start talking about the playoff picture and Super Bowl contenders and that kind of thing, the teams that actually start getting talked about a little more seriously are the squads that have those lines buttoned down and playing well. And so I think Terry's making a salient point about the future of the Orange as it pertains to this year, because he's right. There are question marks on both sides of the ball where the guys play the closest to the rock.
Yeah, so this wasn't the only quote of the day to downplay the team. If you had tuned into Fran Brown's press conference earlier in the day, he was asked about whether Syracuse was going to underestimate Ohio. And Fran Brown says, quote, "In my eyes, they're a better football team than we are," end quote. Now, that is in reference to Ohio having back-to-back double-digit win seasons. But I think it also speaks to how Fran Brown's really trying to level set with expectations. We've had a couple former Syracuse players on the program. Brendan Carney is calling 8 wins. Carl Jones went 9 wins. Andrea Adelson from ESPN comes on this very program, says that she's going to be, quote unquote, shocked if Syracuse isn't playing in the postseason. So I do think it's a deliberate attempt by the brass at Syracuse with Adam Terry on board with that, because he does work for the university, to tamp down some of those expectations, and maybe Syracuse won't be a victim of its own hype. So I guess going back to the original question of what I think of Terry's analysis of 6 wins being a successful season, personally, I think that's a hard sell to the fan base. When you look at the non-conference schedule, Ohio, Holy Cross, UNLV, Connecticut, and the team also avoids FSU and Clemson. So to me, I don't think they just get to 6 wins. I think if they just got that, it would be a disappointment in my mind. My target for this team is 7. That includes a perfect 4-0 non-conference play. So I do disagree with Adam Terry on it.
Yeah, I can see that. We haven't gotten that far in the season preview yet, where I really get into the schedule. But I mean, I understand what Coach Brown is doing is touting Ohio as a team that's coming off back-to-back 10-win seasons. He's building up an opponent who a lot of people won't look at seriously because the name on the jersey or the helmet, and they just kind of go, they're in the MAC, whatever. I mean, I think Ohio's supposed to expected to regress a little bit from the MAC media. I think they finished more middle of the pack in the preseason poll there. So maybe they're like a 7 or 8 win team from the MAC, which is probably, a couple wins in non-conference and then, 6 and 3 in the MAC or whatever that ends up being. So I understand. And I also like, it's the first thing we've seen in Fran Brown's playbook yet is just treating every opponent like they're legitimate and they're dangerous and that sort of thing. I mean, in the research I did, I think UNLV is actually a tougher draw in the non-conference than Ohio. So I think there's a little bit of while there may be some reining in expectations going on, I think it's also, kind of that old school feel that we get in some areas from Brown, where it's like we treat our opponents with respect, we work hard, all those, classic football coach characteristics. And he's never going to come out and just, insult an opponent or say something uncomplimentary, regardless of who it is and the circumstances around the game. I think it's just too much respect for people who do what he does to do that.
We're just getting started here on the Juice on the Cuse podcast. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to break down both the offense and the defense with Jim, so stick around. This is the Bet Online read. Bet Online is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything football. From preseason NFL to college kicking off, Bet Online has every stat, every matchup, even live odds and spreads while the games are being played. Think you know your stuff? Get in on our winner-take-all $300,000 NFL Survivor pool for the upcoming season. And when the game's over, head over to our online casino, get in on a game of blackjack, poker, or unwind with over 150 slot games. Head over to the website today and use promo code BELIEVE, that's BLEAV, to get in on the action. Bet Online, the game starts here. Back here on the Juice on the Cuse podcast. And before the break, Jim was addressing some of the concerns on both sides of the line. Jim, let's take a closer look. I wanted to get you started with the offense. What are your expectations for the season on the offensive side of the ball, especially given your concerns about this relatively patchwork offensive line?
Well, it circles back to what I was talking about in the first segment about the name brand guys versus the not name brand guys. We've spent a lot of the offseason talking about the return of Aronde Gadsden and LaQuint Allen being back for a year and Kyle McCord coming through the portal, along with other guys who we saw in the spring game like Zeed Haynes or, even Yassine Willis, the freshman running back who we got to see in the spring game, who was pretty revealing in how good he could be. He could and frankly should be out of the gate as a backup or change of pace to Allen in what Fran Brown called a thunder and lightning approach. And so we talk about those guys, but we don't talk about the offensive line guys. I mean, it's a combination as the two deep that came out for this week's shows. There's two returning starters at the same positions they were at last year. John Ray Reed at center, started every game last year. Great. Check that off list. Happy to. Jacob Bradford, who started double-digit games at guard. Great. Back again. Wonderful. Interior line looking pretty good. Mark Petrie was a starter last year after David Wollabaugh Jr.'s injury, and he got thrust into the lineup at right tackle. And he had some pretty bumpy moments. I believe the Clemson game in the first half, he, in a span of 2 or 3 plays, it was, he gave up a sack and gave up another quarterback pressure. And I'm just kind of like, this is not looking good. But now he's being moved inside to right guard. And while he was, a double-digit game starter last year, this might be a better fit for him. I mean, I would expect that with the influx of transfers and freshmen coming into the offensive line room as well, that if he's earning this spot on the right guard, this is probably his best position, and they think he's the best competitor for it. Then both tackles are transfers who started last year at other schools, whether it's Weatherspoon at left tackle and Savion Washington at right tackle. And so they're all guys who have starting experience last year, which is good. They're just not all together, which may not be as good. The one part I do like is they were lined up as the first team in a portion of a practice open to the media over 2 weeks ago. And that to me is a good thing, because while you have guys at new positions and guys who are new to the roster, it's hard to build that cohesion. But the fact that these guys have been working together for 2 weeks, actually for longer than 2 weeks in camp, is a good sign, because they have a chance to build that cohesion, communication, everything kind of becomes hand in glove. Teamwork is developed between these 5 guys. I think that's the most promising thing about this offensive line, especially when factoring the fact that they all started last year, whether it was at Syracuse or another stop along the way.
Yeah, so Jim, I've certainly the offensive line discussion, for all the concerns you just stated, is going to be something to monitor. And I was just looking through the depth chart that just came out on Monday ahead of the Ohio game, and there's a couple other areas I want to touch on outside of the offensive line. I think no Justice Ross Simmons. My understanding is that he's been battling a hamstring injury all camp. So if you look at the 2 deep chart at wide receiver, you see true freshman Emmanuel Ross, rated a Rivals 4-star prospect. He's on the 2 deep behind Trevor Pena. So that to me was a little bit of a surprise. The other true freshman you mentioned on the offensive depth chart, Yassine Willis, also Rivals 4-star prospect, lining up behind LaQuint Allen. That's less of a surprise because he's just been so spectacular throughout camp and throughout all the scrimmages. So, but two true freshmen on an offensive 2 deep, I think, is significant. And then, of course, the other area you have to address is quarterback depth, because Kyle McCord, as Adam Terry pointed out, has only 12 starts to his name at Ohio State. But other than that, Michael Johnson Jr. has thrown, one collegiate pass in his 3 years at college. And then you have Carlos Del Rio Wilson, who really struggled at quarterback last year, throwing 4 interceptions in that game against BC. So health in the quarterback room is really going to play a huge role here. There's just not a ton of depth behind Kyle McCord. So if they want to have a successful season, that's where you really need to help him. And again, that offensive line is going to play a big role toward that. But Jim, I certainly want to transition from the offensive side to the defensive side of the ball. Again, I know you have their concerns. You have concerns there. So what do you have for us there?
Well, it's the same version of what we talked about on the with the offense, as far as there being the guys who put up stats that we're aware of and the guys who don't. I mean, when I look at the two deep that came out, it's Fadil Diggs and a bunch of guys that we don't know a ton about. There's a couple other guys who are rotation players, whether here or elsewhere, like Tank Wilson, the transfer from New Mexico State. Like, he's been a rotational guy in his career at other stops before coming here, and he's going to be starting at defensive tackle. But Isaiah Hastings is an unknown commodity as another guy who transferred to the program. Dennis Jacquez Jr. is the other starting defensive end, and we've seen him a little bit as a rotational piece. I mean, we're not expecting, guys in the defensive line are not going to log 85, 90% snap rates. I mean, Diggs might be the exception because of his leadership and ability out there, but he's the one guy in the line who you can say, I know what this guy can do. I know what this guy can bring. And then you have that level of expectations for him appropriate. Like, he is a guy who you can change a game, but there's, a dozen names on the two deep, with a bunch of guys listed as or, and it's just kind of like, well, is it a hot hand thing as the game goes on? Or, is it going to be a strict rotation of like, we got to see what these guys can do and build up? I mean, I'm not worried about the secondary question I have is about the secondary, and specifically the corners. I don't worry about Marlowe Wax and Darren McDonald at linebacker. And I certainly don't worry about the guys in the middle of the defensive backfield between Justin Barron and Elijah Clark and Deuce Chestnut. Chestnut was a cornerback the first time around, but one of the things we saw while he was here was he has amazing instincts. He had, tremendous, he broke up wide receiver screens in the backfield by reading the play and had, PBUs behind the line of scrimmage, something that just, shows his ability to see and understand what's going to happen and then make a play before that play can happen. And so I think his transition to free safety is probably going to work great, because if he's allowed to roam out there and feed into those instincts, he could have a massive season, roaming all over the field and wreaking havoc on opposing passing games. The cornerbacks, however, Clarence Lewis is a starter and Marcellus Barnes is a starter. Two guys who we haven't really seen play at Syracuse before. And Barnes, we didn't see him because he was in high school last year. And so I'm not knocking the kid. He committed in an All-American game on television to Syracuse. So there's pedigree there, and it just remains to be seen if that pedigree is going to translate. Like, it makes me concerned a bit that, he was able to rise this quickly on the two deep, because it makes me wonder about, other players who are on the roster. Are they able to be contributors? Jaden Bellamy's played some at corner last year. He's behind Clarence Lewis at one corner. And Devin Grant, the transfer from Buffalo, is listed as the backup to Barnes at the other corner. And Grant played safety while he was at Buffalo. So I think it might be something where Grant's getting a position switch just so his ability is on, so he can play a little more, because I don't see Clark, Barron, and Chestnut leaving the field that often. I think those guys are going to be staples in that defensive backfield. So it's that middle level of the defense and the middle of the defensive backfield I feel great about. And I think it's reasonable to have questions otherwise.
Yeah, so I spoke about Willis and Ross on the offensive side of the ball, being on the two deep as true freshmen, but there's way more on the defensive side of the ball, right? Again, I'm looking through this depth chart. So Fran Brown brings in the best recruiting class in Syracuse history, at least as far as modern recruiting rankings go. You talked about Marcellus Barnes, the 4-star defensive back. Again, he's an All-American. He committed at the All-American game, and he's listed as a starting cornerback. And then on the defensive line, I mean, the two deep features essentially all true freshmen: King Joseph Edwards, Murad Watson, Rashard Perry, Jahai Lassane, all listed on the two deep at that defensive line position, which I know that you have a lot of questions about. So that's a weakness of the team, as you mentioned. But I also think if you flip the argument on its head, it shows that Fran Brown recruited his freshman class really well and that they are going to contribute this season. I think that's one of the main things that popped out at me when I looked at the depth chart for the week.
Yeah, I agree. It shows that he's willing to play these young guys, which is something that also can pay dividends down the line, is when he's recruiting kids out of high school, where he could literally say, do you see what we did this year? And if it's Barnes starting every game or Yassine Willis getting 120 carries, it's like, if you are good enough, you can come here and play as a freshman. And I don't have to promise you that you do that. You've seen that I will play guys. So that makes all the sense in the world to me, as that is, a possibility. It just makes me worry a little bit, especially, younger guys, especially smaller guys, because like a King Joseph Edwards comes with a good pedigree, but he's a 225-pound defensive end. And that it's not ideal. But if he's the best player, then he should play. No doubt about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great recruiting pitch, going back to your first point, Jim. If you are considering Georgia or Ohio State, where you're going to need to ride the pine for at least a couple seasons, probably take a red shirt, and then Fran Brown comes along and says, hey, you can play Power 5 football. This is a school that can get you to the NFL, but you're going to play right away. I do think that's a legitimate recruiting pitch he can make because, again, you look at this too deep and it's littered with true freshmen, and that's not something that you're going to see everywhere. We're going to take a quick break, but still to come, a Syracuse legend gets another recognition, and Jim wants to recognize a Syracuse Twitter account that you may not be following. This is the Juice on the Cuse podcast. Back on the Juice on the Cuse podcast, Wes Cheng alongside Jim Stechschulte. Jim, you've got a unique Twitter handle that you wanted to talk about to close the show.
Yeah, it's one of the Twitter handles from the university that's in the athletic department, that it's not really a massive foul. It's not an individual sport or, much less a big sport, but it's just at Cuse Promos, CUSE PROMOS. They tell you what's going on the athletic calendar. I mean, if you want to support an athletic program that's not one of the big revenue sports, something other than football or lacrosse or women's basketball, one of the big sports, Cuse Promos is a good sport to follow, a good account to follow. They put out a weekly schedule and let you know what's going on. Whether you're someone who lives locally and maybe you have a Taylor Swift and soccer fan in the house and you want to hit up Thursday afternoon's women's soccer game for Taylor Swift Day when the Orange take on Northwestern, or if you're coming into town for the Ohio game, for the football game on Saturday. Well, Friday night, the volleyball team is taking on Lafayette at the women's building. And it could be a nice way to support, a program that you've never really thought of supporting, but like, hey, these kids, or our athletes too, who represent the Orange, and they could use some support too. I mean, after all, you might find me at the women's building a little earlier on Friday for a volleyball game against the New Jersey Institute of Technology Day. It's pajama day. It's 11 a.m. Let's go have some fun.
Jim, mark your calendars not only for that game, but September 7th, Syracuse will host Georgia Tech at the Dome, and College and Pro Football Hall of Famer Dwight Freeney will have his number 54 jersey hung in the rafters. What could you say about Freeney? Former Big East Defensive Player of the Year, All-American, went on to an incredible NFL career, Super Bowl win with the Colts, 125.5 sacks over a 16-year career that ranks 18th all-time in the NFL. Here's another person, speaking of non-revenue sports, Cherry Hicks will also be honored, a 6-time Big East individual throwing champion. She's going to be recognized at SU's game against Stanford. So very cool to see. Congratulations to both of them for more honors. That's it for us. For Jim Stechschulte, this is Wes Cheng. You've been listening to the Juice on the Cuse podcast on the Believe in Rivals networks, and we will see you next time.